Illegal immigration and crime themselves were not given due process. You had a very interesting response to that. So let's play the clip and then we'll hear your take. Let's take a listen.
How do you determine, or how do your people in the field determine that somebody is a gang member?
Look, there's various methods. No, I've noticed in the media this week, a lot of them don't have criminal histories. Well, a lot of gang members don't have criminal histories. Just like a lot of terrorists in this world, they're not in any terrorist database, right? We only know the information what's in databases based on, for instance, most terrorists we arrest that are identified by the U.S. government are later identified through a Title III investigation or through an undercover operation. They're not in any terrorist screening database. We know that. A lot of gang members, I started as a cop in 1984. Many gang members don't have a criminal history. So we have a count on social media. We have a count on surveillance techniques. We have a count on sworn statements from other gang members. We have a count on, wiretaps and Title III. So everything involved with criminal investigations come into play. So just because someone hasn't been arrested and charged with a crime yet, doesn't mean they're a member of a gang.
But how do you? I mean, what we've heard from lawyers representing some of these people is that they deny that they're members of this gang. Or either, Tren de Aragua or MS-13. Do they get a chance to prove that before you take them out of the country and put them into a notorious prison in a country that they're not even from? I mean, do they have any due process at all?
Confident. Look, due process. Where's Lake and Riley's due process? Where were all these young women that were killed and raped by members of TDA? Where was their due process?
Well, the people that did that should be prosecuted.
On the subway, where's her due process?
Well, sure.
The bottom line is that plane was full of people designated as terrorists. Number one. Number two, every Venezuelan migrant on that flight was a TDA member based on numerous criminal investigations, on intelligence reports, and a lot of work by ICE officers.
Glenn, what do you make of that argument?
First of all, it's kind of weird because the older you get, the more you realize that history really does just repeat itself, and not by century, but even by decade. We're back in 2002, where we're hearing all of the arguments from the Bush and Cheney administration that they have the right to do anything they want to people they and they alone have decided are terrorists. And that includes putting people into prison indefinitely with no due process, torturing them, kidnapping them, rendering them, whatever else they wanted to do. And when people objected and said, wait a minute, these people don't even have an opportunity to go into court and disprove or contest the accusations that you made against them, that they're not part of a terrorist organization, what we heard was, oh, don't worry, we vetted these people and we can assure you that these people are not just terrorists, but they're the worst of the worst. As it turns out, many, according to Colin Powell's chief of staff, Larry Wilkinson, most ended up not being part of any terrorist organization. They were picked up randomly. The intelligence was wrong. Sometimes vindictively, people reported them to the U.S. military. All kinds of reasons the government makes mistakes. And that's the whole point of due process, is we don't trust just one branch of government to do something as cataclysmic as throw people into a dungeon for life without even bothering to have to present evidence that they're guilty, and giving the people who are so accused the opportunity to contest it. And the other point that he made that makes absolutely no sense, and a police officer should know this better than anyone, is due process is most necessary for people who are accused of horrific crimes. Lake and Riley's killers didn't just get thrown in a dungeon because the government decided that they were guilty. They were given lawyers, formal charges, went through all of our judicial procedures, were found guilty in a court of law, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. So the idea that, of course, no murderers, no kidnappers, no rapists give their victims due process, but we still give due process to the people who are accused of criminality before we can punish them, because the founders knew, first and foremost, that humans are not infallible. And they're going to make mistakes. And we've made mistakes all the time, even with due process. We've convicted people wrongly and unjustly. Imagine how many mistakes get made when you just hand over the power to government officials in the executive branch to declare who is and is not guilty, with no opportunity for the person who's accused to disprove the charges. And that is exactly what's happening.
Glenn, I think what's made this so difficult for me is it feels dispositionally as if the law is something that is being almost used in a process way, not just due process, but it's one where it feels as if the Constitution and the law seems to apply only for deportation, but it didn't necessarily apply, let's say, when people were being allowed into the country and then were victimizing people who were here. It does feel, at least to me, as if this argumentation and this love of due process, et cetera, only comes into play whenever it's the, you know, supposedly sympathetic group here, let's say, of migrants, when we don't necessarily hear the same for, let's say, people who are coming here illegally, committing crimes. Then it's like, oh, well, of course, this is something that is naturally to happen. They have a lower, let's say, crime rate than the natural born population, the implication that you shouldn't even worry about. So for people like me who have really complicated feelings about this stuff, how should we feel watching this and trying to balance those two issues of wanting, let's say, mass deportation, the selective application, let's say, of concern? What would you say to those critics?
Well, the whole reason Trump has made this a signature issue of mass deportation, and he won twice, and polls clearly show, in addition to that, that people support mass deportation, was because the idea was that people entering our country illegally have done something wrong, have done something criminal. So the idea is, because they didn't give us due process or they didn't get due process, we should now relinquish due process, is essentially to say, let's copy and replicate and adopt the worst abuses of the policies that Donald Trump for a decade has been most harshly criticizing. I think the bigger point, though, is that when Donald Trump has stood up for a decade now and argued for mass deportation, typically mass deportation, not just typically, but almost in every case, means that you take somebody who is in your country illegally and you send them back to their country of origin. You send them back to where they're a citizen or where they came from. That is always how deportation works. The reason this has become so controversial is because the Trump administration is not picking up Venezuelans or others and sending them back to their country of origin. They're sending them on purpose to a third country that these people have nothing to do with. They're not citizens of El Salvador. Most of them, if not all of them, have never been to El Salvador. And the reason we're sending them to El Salvador is because we know they have a repressive prison system, probably the worst in the world, where they're not only going to be humiliated and tortured and stripped of all human rights, but it's extremely unlikely that they're ever going to leave. So this is a radical departure from what we think of and call deportation. This is consigning somebody not just to life in prison, but to one of the worst prisons, life in one of the worst prisons that people very rarely leave. And if you don't believe that the government, the US government under the Constitution, owes people the right of due process, of a hearing, of an opportunity to disprove the accusations, not before we deport them back to their country of origin, but before we send them on purpose to a hellhole of a prison that they're likely never going to leave, prison for life, without even an inkling of a process, a requirement the government show the evidence and the opportunity of the person so accused to contest it, then you don't believe in due process at all. Then you simply believe in an authoritarian government that can just accuse people in secret of being guilty, and that's the end of the story. And that has never been the founding value of the United States. You mentioned the Benjamin Franklin quote that I had cited, where he said, it is more just to allow 100 guilty people to go free than to punish wrongfully a single innocent person. That comes from Blackstone, which is the foundation of American and British law. Thomas Jefferson is attributed to say something very similar, but certainly all of his writings and all of the founders' writings, that was the idea. You know, let me just give you a quick example. We impose limits on police officers that make it more difficult for them to catch violent criminals. They're not, for example, allowed to just burst into houses where they suspect that somebody guilty might be there. They first have to go to a court, get a warrant, and we require that even knowing that sometimes it's going to mean that violent criminals get away because we're putting barriers in front of the police. But we're a country of liberty. We've decided we would rather have those liberties, even if there's a cost to it. And due process is exactly that. And it's something foundational to the United States. And it can't be waived simply because people are frustrated with illegal immigration, especially when it's not sending them back to their home country, but putting them into a horrific prison in a dictatorial country in El Salvador, where you've seen all the video of things that they do to these people that would never be permitted in the United States.
And there's also that famous quote, you know, people who trade liberty for security will get neither. And just to sketch in how that unfolded in this moment, we can just very quickly run through a couple of the examples, because we're talking about the question on principle, but also in practice, we see exactly what unfolded. Roll A2 really quickly. This is just like this gay barber who is like, we're asking people